the most scared I've ever been was calling my parents to tell them that I dropped out of college. What am I going to get value-wise out of sitting in a classroom versus working at a startup?
There's a trap here.
Most people don't realize that you can create your own luck. Truly, I think of intuition like a muscle.
Is empathy something somebody can learn?
People will always love you more if all you do is ask questions about them.
What's one of your best questions you have ready to go at any time? In our conversation that we had a couple weeks ago, and then as I've been able to do a bunch of research on all things Ryan, which has been really fun, one thing that keeps sticking out to me is the role of the word I put on it is intuition. Seems like there's, from choosing to not pursue the career that you thought you were going to pursue to moving to India. We can talk about any of these in particular, whichever one makes sense for you to dive into. But it seems to me the pattern that I see is that you're willing to listen to intuition. And I think intuition is something that most entrepreneurs, most founders, either they doubt it or they don't see the value in it. I'm just wondering, do you think of it in those terms of using intuition, and how do you relate to it?
Yeah, it's really interesting that you bring that up. Intuition's a really interesting word for me because I've thought a lot about it. And the conclusion that I've come to is that intuition is strengthened and fortified through action. And so I think of intuition like a muscle. And I think that the reason, something that I think about a lot and that I talk to a lot of people about is most people don't realize that you can create your own luck. You can create your own opportunities. And the reality of it is I just realized, a couple of years ago when I was sitting in college, I just joined my first startup and I felt this thought. I was just I think I want to work in startups full time. And then I was like, but that means I have to drop out of school. And then I was like, well, all right, let's weigh the factors here. I have to sit in a classroom for 20 hours a week, and that takes 20 hours away from being able to work full time. Yeah. What am I going to get value-wise out of sitting in a classroom versus working at a startup? And I learned more in those first 3 months at a startup than I had I'd taken one marketing class, and that was the one that made me want to drop out of college because it was taught by an incredible professor that was just a seasoned entrepreneur. And so for me, when it comes down to intuition, I truly think that intuition is a reward because of action. And a lot of people will say you just need to trust your gut. You need to trust your intuition. But that also means you have to take action. You have to act on that intuition. And for me, every time that I've felt my intuition saying, hey, you should do this, I've acted on it because what's the worst that can happen? Yeah. I would still have a year and a half left in college if I'd stayed in school. And we just packed up and moved across the country 7 weeks after we had our first baby. And it's been the most rewarding experience. But my backup plan is I'll just go build something else if this one doesn't work out, right? You just make it happen. But I truly think that intuition, I think that intuition is a muscle that needs to be trained and used over and over again for it to be properly built. And there's a really good book called Blink by Malcolm Gladwell that talks all about intuition. Yeah. So.
Yeah, intuition is a paradox, right? Or it's part of a paradox. It's one side of a paradox. And this is what I talk with my clients a lot about, is that usually people are imbalanced on this paradox, whether they're super analytical or very, very intuitive. Yep. And they lean to one side or the other. The interesting thing about a paradox, two ideas that seem that they contradict, is when we're actually high in both. When we use our analytical brain and we're willing to pay attention to our intuition, that's a true strength. Then we can get a more whole picture. So that's what I hear you talking about, is you started to analyze some of the things that were going on, some of the things that weren't lining up for you in going to college, getting the degree, going down that athletic director path, didn't line up for you. That's the analytical part. And the intuition was oh, well, I don't have to do this. I could do something. I could do whatever I want. Is that a difficult decision for you to make? To follow something that you're not quite sure, that it's unclear, that it doesn't seem like the path well trodden?
The first time I ever felt like I followed my intuition was the hardest. And then every time after that, it got easier. And that first time, again, it was dropping out of college. That was 3 years ago in August. And why that was such a monumental moment for me was I was so worried, not of like, I knew that I would be fine. I knew that I was going to be okay if I dropped out of college. I knew that I didn't need a degree, right? My wife went medical. She had to get her degree. She worked in radiology and in the echo department, did heart ultrasounds. Like, obviously you need a degree for things like that. But for me, I was just like, I know I'm going to be able to make it just fine if I don't have a degree. What I was worried about was my family is so just ingrained in education. You know, both of my parents have masters. My 2 grandpas worked in higher education. One of my grandmas was an educator. Both of my brothers have masters.
Expectations there.
And then I dropped out of college, right? And so, but it was never, I'd written myself this story that they were going to think that I was just this like delinquent or degenerate, right?
Yeah.
And the most scared I've ever been was calling my parents to tell them that I dropped out of college. And they're like, Ryan, we 100% support you and you've always done things your own way.
Good for mom and dad.
And so it was like in that moment, I was like, all right, like what's the worst that can happen? Right? Like I've been making money and doing side hustles since I was 11 years old, making duct tape wallets and then doing YouTube videos for longboard companies, right? Like my backup plan has always just been that like, we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
And so the intuition was hard to follow on that first one because of all of the weighing factors and outside factors of what other people would think. And then as I realized, as I got over that, and it was truly just a decision for me and my family, everything became so much easier. Because again, the worst that can happen at the end of the day is whatever you're working on doesn't work out. And the reality of it is, if it doesn't work out, it probably wasn't supposed to work out anyways. And there's a better opportunity that's waiting for you at the end of the road.
Yeah. It's amazing the pressure we put on ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. The stories that we make up about what people expect of us, what the world expects of us, what we're going to have to do in order to be successful. That just sticks out to me as you tell that story, is like you put all this pressure on yourself. What would your parents think? And you could have easily talked yourself out of making that decision if you would have followed that story that you made up.
Right.
And so many people do, right? So many people create that story and it keeps them from ever taking the step that they know they really want to take, when that pressure may be completely fabricated in your own experience.
Right.
That's crazy.
Right.
You said something interesting the other day when we were talking, and I said, well, hey, Ryan, what's your superpower? Do you remember what you answered?
I don't.
You said empathy.
Huh.
You said empathy is my superpower. And I thought that was such an interesting answer.
Must have been a deep morning.
It must have been a
deep
very
reflection morning. Now that you say that, it rings a bell.
Or you were sleep deprived. I don't know. Either one.
No, I had gotten plenty of sleep.
Well, I think I grouped these together under this idea of intuition because I actually think that empathy is a factor of intuition. And I'm just wondering, for you, what were you thinking about? Why did you answer intuition? And maybe if you don't know what you're thinking about, but
empathy or intuition?
Or empathy, sorry.
Empathy, I think, is the root of all good marketing and sales. And empathy is the root of connection. And if you're not able to truly put your thoughts aside and empathize with the other person on the other side of the conversation, if you only care about what your experiences are and what you've done, you don't ask a single question about what their background is or what interests them, there's no way for you to actually make that connection. And on that day, I had been thinking about, I meet a lot of new people. I have a goal to meet a new person every day. I send a shoot your shot message every day to create luck and opportunity. And I'd say on average, I meet 35 to 50 new people a week. Mm-hmm. And one of the tips that I got from a mentor of mine, his name's John Bowers. He's the chief business officer at Silicon Slopes. When I worked on his team was, I asked him, I was like, I was at an event with him and I was like, John, you have this ability to always find what seems like the needle in the haystack at events like this. Like he had just met someone that was really cool. He was telling me a story. It was a dream opportunity to connect them with the organization that we were working for at Silicon Slopes. And he said, I always try to connect with people on some sort of piece or nugget or topic outside of the current environment that we're in. So he equated that to a plane. He said, I always try to land the plane and then connect on something outside of where we are. So if we're, at a mingling event or a networking event, rather than saying like, oh, what brings you here? Like connecting on something outside of that event then establishes that connection, and then start talking on a much deeper level. So, I've got my things that I'll roll through, like, asking about sports or what they like doing in their free time. And then you just connect on that and go deeper and deeper. But when it comes to empathy, I truly believe that empathy is at the root of all human connection. Because if you can't truly try to understand someone and love them for who they are, there's no way that you're ever going to get anything from them. And not that that's what it's about, but it's the equivalent, it's the universal law of equivalent exchange. Like anything that you put out there, you'll get back in equal to or greater to value, whether that be positive or negative. But empathy is at the root of everything.
Yeah, I love that. Is empathy, do you think, is empathy something somebody can learn?
Again, like intuition, I think it is something that's trained. Like as a 16-year-old kid, I was the most egotistical, rambunctious, undiagnosed ADHD kid in the world. And all I cared about was having fun experiences and talking about it with all my friends and talking about me. And then I realized this was actually something that my dad shared with me. He said, people will always love you more if all you do is ask questions about them. Yeah. And so there was like this light switch went off in me. It flipped in me. And it was just like, if you care so much about the other people in your life will be so much better. And so for me, and how I think of it is, again, empathy and intuition are muscles that have to be trained. But how do you train yourself to be more empathetic? Ask questions. If you can, I have a book that I think it's called like 400 questions to ask people. Found it at Goodwill for $1.99. I could talk about Goodwill books all day. But it's just like, I sit there and Google questions to ask people to like truly draw out what they think about. I don't like having conversations that are just surface level. Like, again, my whole premise on life is it's too short to just have the surface level questions. Talk about the things that you talk about with everyone else. If you want to have a lasting impact, have a conversation that they've never had before and build that empathy and trust and connection, which is at the root of everything.
What's one of your best questions you have on the ready to go at any time?
One of my favorite questions to ask people, I have two that I'll ask when I'm at events to talk with people about. And I always try to play the conduit between connections at events. Yeah. And this was a tip that was given to me by my friend Landon Ainge. And he said, I always ask people two questions. One, what are you currently working on? And two, what are the problems that you face to growth? And then connecting people that could solve their problem within my network to solve their problems. And then the other one that I'll ask people once we've like established the friendship is like, what's the hardest lesson that you learned from a failure? And asking them about that. And then you draw deeper into the experience, talk about what happened, why it happened, where it happened, learning more of the ecosystem of where they were operating in and learning and talking about the people that they were working with and just expanding on that. But I love talking about failures because it's not talked about enough. Yeah. And again, everyone has failed at something. And so if you can draw out that connection through failure, that's something that most people won't talk about. But then if they can trust you and you draw that question out from them and you're like, you honestly ask them and they know that they can confide in you what they learned from a failure, it's immediate. It's an immediate connection with those people. Yeah.
There's a trap here. And I just want to make sure that I'm clear with people who are listening that there is a trap. This is not a formula. Yeah. So if you go and ask a question like that and then you don't listen and you don't care, it's going to do more damage to the relationship than if you just never would have even introduced yourself to the person.
100%.
So that's where the power is that learning. I love that you talk about learning to listen. It is a practice. There are disciplines and practices that you can put in place in your life in order to make sure that you're learning to listen to people. It's not something that comes naturally. At least I don't believe it's something that comes naturally, because naturally we're looking at me, right? That's the natural state of the human being, because you got to take care of yourself. It's written in our bones evolutionarily. Like, I got to take care of me because I got to stay alive and I got to preserve energy to stay alive. Like, those are our two main goals if you look at it from an evolutionary standpoint. 100%. So just knowing that you're your own worst enemy in listening and empathy and going into situations, being willing to practice, this isn't about me. What difference do I want to make with them? Yep. Right. So even in this moment before you show up, Ryan, I'm thinking to myself, what difference do I want to make with Ryan in this moment? that would be significant or that would be a mark in his book. And that takes all of the aim off of me of like, oh, I want to look good. I want to be in control. I want to, all of that racket that I run inside my brain that would cause disconnection between us. And now I'm thinking, how do I serve you? How do I be with you in a meaningful way? And that's the trap, is that if you don't make that switch in your brain, you'll be detected.
Yep. And then the most valuable thing that you could ever do to a new person that you meet is introduce them to someone you know. There's no greater display of trust or value in a relationship when you find enough value in someone new that you meet to then introduce them to someone that you know. And the 10 times better brownie points if you can solve one of their problems. So if you know what problem they're facing to growth, or if you know what problem they're facing to landing new clients, or who's their ideal clientele, if you can connect them with someone, immediate establishment of trust. But again, you have to truly want to understand what they're working on and what their needs are to be able to build a friendship with them. And if you don't come from a point of understanding, you just ask the question to ask, then you're just going to get the answer because they're answering the question. Right?
Yeah.
They're going to give you what you think they want. Whereas if you can truly empathize with them and want to understand, then you'll always be a solution to their needs.
Yeah. Case in point, I mean, we met through a mutual friend, Sean Finnegan, and he's a master at this. And it came from him asking the question, hey man, what are you working on? Who do you need to talk to?
Yep.
And bingo, hey, I know Ryan, you got to talk to him. He's amazing.
Yeah. My network has 10x'd in quantity and quality since I've known Sean Finnegan.
Yeah.
And I met him 6 months ago.
Yeah.
He's become one of my best friends. Seriously.
So great. Thank you so much for joining us here on Founders League. If you want more of the conversation that you just watched, make sure to use the link in the description below. Also, if this video created value for you, please consider liking it, subscribing to the channel, and even commenting, telling us what you enjoyed about it, what you got out of it. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, peace.